Hi, good morning, afternoon from John Cockburn-Evans and Deborah Russell. We are experienced coaches and consultants in the arena of culture transformation and change management. We're here today to talk about the next topic in our team leadership series, the importance of interactions between process and outcome in a coaching or consulting context, and some of the problems surrounding this. So we're going to have an informal discussion which hopefully provides some insights on the topic. And one of the triggers we both had for this topic in our respective working experiences was that sometimes clients get confused between process and outcome. And this can be a critical derailer in the effective delivery of a change management program. And we've both seen this from different angles, and we'll try and explore this topic so that the listeners have a greater understanding and with the potential to navigate some paths forward for dealing with this in their own organisations where appropriate. Now, hopefully you will be able to put these into your own context and start working on ways getting the balance right with your own teams as a means of driving more clarity amongst those you are working with to attain better outcomes. So John, this is certainly something that comes up a lot in coaching. Now, how many times do we draw attention to the journey? Particularly when things don't go quite as we expected. And it's very easy to focus on one or the other and lose sight of either the outcome or the benefits of the journey. But I'm sure this is going to come out of the conversation that we're going to be having a little bit later. So let's get started. So where do you think this comes into play, John?
Well, thank you, Deb. Yes, it's a really good point around us getting sort of absorbed is the best word in the journey, which we can argue is the process, rather than necessarily thinking continually about the outcome. And I think the point is that the outcome is something that is talked at the front end, but sometimes forgotten. And in fact, in my experience, it's amazing how many clients confuse the difference, confuse the two, even experienced clients, right, between process and outcome. And what we find is that there's usually clarity at the start of any engagement, but that clarity can diminish over time. There are numerous potential reasons for that, and we'll cover that in more depth in the wider discussion. But it's usually because teams dive into the detail right at the start and boundaries get blurred.
Yeah, yes, sure. So, John, you come from a scientific and processing background, and I come from a customer service and hospitality background. So for clarity, what do we mean in generic terms by a process?
Yes, and it's interesting. You can define a process many ways. I'll define the scientific one, as you say, because I try and bring scientific analogies into my coaching, because sometimes it helps people who are more oriented towards the science side of things. But a process can be many things. The scientific definition is probably where anything starts in one state, it's acted on by something or someone, and transformed into another state. So for example, that could be a chemical reaction, it could be a piece of machining work, or something as simple as heating or cooling. In a management context, there are many examples. For instance, this could be knowledge transfer, such as coaching, consulting, training, or any other form of interaction.
Okay, so following on from that then, what do we mean by an outcome?
Well, again, there are many definitions of outcomes, but the one I tend to use is an intended state that has an innate improvement over the original input. I think this definition holds good for most things. It does not necessarily follow the outcome has to be positive, particularly when a process can go awry. And of course, processes do go awry, whether it be a physical process or an intellectual process. However, the intention is always about betterment, and it's worthwhile remembering that. It's worth noting that the outcomes don't have to be hard or physical. They can be soft or emotional. They can also be short-lived or transient. In the case of a larger project, there may be numerous micro outcomes supporting the larger outcome.
Okay, so we're looking at a form of transformation or change that ultimately delivers an outcome. And as you say, there's always some form of betterment. Now, it's interesting that you define the difference between hard or physical and soft or emotional outcomes, because maybe the latter is sometimes overlooked. How often do we evaluate an outcome from an emotional level when the focus is so instinctively on the hard or physical level? If I look at an example in my own history, if I look at a wedding or a conference, something very people focused, we would look at how everything went in terms of the equipment and the timing, all the procedures, was the food hot or cold enough, and quantity and quality, etc. But who's actually looking to see if people are smiling or having fun or laughing and joking, looking round and just absorbing the atmosphere? Who's studying that when you are actually focusing on the hard process? And I suppose the same can be said for a scientific outcome. Or have I lost the point?
No, you've got the point extremely, you put the point extremely well. And I suppose a lot depends as well on the context or the perspective of the event, as you say. It's quite clearly, although there are transactional processes involved in organizing a wedding, there is the emotional side as well. And that actually is very, very important to the outcome, because they want the wedding to go well. And that will be an emotional reaction as much as, a transactional one. So it's very, very important. And I think it is a question of sort of stepping back sometimes and just thinking what's really important. I think you liked earlier on, the journey that we get involved in our coaching, which is linked to the process. That is important, right? Because that's the way that we help people. But the outcome is equally as important. And sometimes, as I said earlier, that's where we lose focus. And that outcome can be a hard physical outcome, or it can be an emotional one.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And it's interesting how that happens, but somehow not surprising, as we do get lost in the sea of complexity during the process, don't we? I can think of an example with the National Health Service project group appearing to have got really, really snowed down in the process, and the outcome not being available quickly enough as a result of the detail that frankly perhaps hadn't been anticipated. It's not a criticism at all, but an example where intention was really excellent, but the process became a bit of a nightmare. So how can this be resolved?
Yeah, I think that's and before I answer that last question, I think you're right, is that your point that you made about the intention, Debbie, is really important. I think in my experience, I can't imagine the situations where the intentions weren't right. It's after the intention that things start to go wrong, because lines get blurred. So to answer the second question, where do I think the problems lie? Well, as always, there is a level of confusion or misinterpretation which can lead to problems. There are a myriad of examples. If we take the context of consulting, the consultant firm wants to demonstrate value. That is their raison d'etre, their right of being. They've been hired to find solutions to problems or challenges. So at that point, the brain or collective brains will start thinking about solutions immediately. The cognitive parts of our brains will jump into a process on the how to solve the problem. And at this point, the narrative about the outcome can become lost. I've seen plenty of examples in consulting where this happens. Usually as the team gets pulled together, the team starts putting a proposal together, the value add for any consultant is usually the how to and not the what. Usually clients will have an inkling of what their challenges are, but it's the why and the how. That's why they've reached out. They don't necessarily know what the solution process should be or the scope of the positive outcomes. This is where the consultants or providers must be clear in their own minds on the differences between process and outcome. If they don't have a clear themselves, how can they correct the messages and get the correct messages across to the client without confusing or blurring? And that's a really, really important point. This usually happens when teams dive into detail too early, which is something I alluded to earlier. It's easy to trivialize this challenge, but if you can imagine a large transformation project, getting lines blurred has the potential to cause a huge amount of damage. One of the areas I'm constantly directing teams to avoid is scope or mission creep. There was a very famous project in the UK back in the early 2000s, the Scottish Parliament building, where they needed to build a new, home for the Scottish Parliament. 30,000 metre squared building. Original budget was in the region of 40 million. And at the end, the final project cost was 414 million, which is just huge. That's 10 times, you know. I know from my own experience in construction in the past, that would have caused me personally a lot of problems in terms of performance of that happened. But again, to go back to your earlier point about intention, the intention was probably, you know, pure, but that's, you know, people put it down to the fact that there was scope or mission creep, and more people got involved, you know, than maybe they should have done. And this is where you have to sort of also step back and look at the outcome rather than just look at the process in this case. And as you've mentioned, you know, you've mentioned the NHS projects, and historically there have been a few problems where NHS IT projects have lost their way through mission creep or scope rows, a loss of focus and outcome because people have delved into things, you know, too early and in too much detail. So, yes, good.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about the detail, and we've talked, you know, many a time about the detail monster. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you know, we've covered the manifestations of the challenge, you know, and you know, and this is one of the areas where I try and resolve these conundrums. But I've seen it over and over again where people dive into this detail. And one of the expressions I use, I know we've joked a bit before, is I said, beware the detail monster, because the more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. Now, one of the ways that we can deal with this is checking in and checking out, which is what we do with coaching clients. You know, try and take the bird's eye view or the helicopter view rather than what I call the weeds review, because when you are down in the weeds, what you do is you end up seeing a lot of detail and getting involved in a lot of detail. So if you can sort of check out of that process, then that helps a lot. And one of the tools I tend to use sometimes is getting people to do, you know, stakeholder engagement or stakeholder maps, and just actively have sessions or program sessions where people do check out. If you think again, Deb, in coaching, we call it detached involvement, you know?
Mm. Yeah, well, we both know about getting bogged down in the detail, and we can identify that as the imposter syndrome kicking in. It's a great expression, getting into your helicopter to just reflect on, and I find myself doing that more and more, just to look at what's going on periodically outside of the process that's going on. And what I wonder often is, when does the process become more important than the outcome? Because we often in coaching do concentrate on the process, don't we, to make sure that we see the benefits drawn from any journey. And so we reframe the lenses through which our client is looking, particularly where they may be disappointed with the outcome. So where's the fine line or the overlap?
Well, I think the key thing here is a balance. You know, the two must work in harmony. If you get too focused on process, you know, we discussed that at length already, we can lose sight of the outcome. But if you don't get focused enough on the process, right, sometimes you can get into a situation where the end justifies the means, and the process can be a bit haphazard and not structured, because you just think, well, all that matters is the outcome, you know. And you've heard that in other situations like politics, where, you know, people just turn around and say, it doesn't matter, we got there in the end, we got the result, the process doesn't matter. Now, okay, that works to an extent, but also, you know, sometimes if the process is wrong, it can do harm, right? And again, if I go back to my construction background, where we did a lot of training, if you don't follow a rigorous process and adhere to it with a level of discipline, that's absolutely where things can go wrong. And the same can happen with human interventions as well. You know, we can actually, you think about coaching, we could say or do something that may be inappropriate. So I think it is a fine balance, and that's where we have to keep going back to this checking in, checking out, helicopter view, weeds view, detached involvement, Deborah.
Yeah. And so, do you think the situation is getting better or worse?
It's a difficult one. On balance, I would say possibly worse, you know, away from the pandemic, but more the fact that we've become so digitally enabled, and almost to the point, some would argue, we've become a bit, you know, digital zombies, which is like share, which in theory, you could argue the parallel is that's very much about the outcome. You know, I want to feel gratification. I want to give somebody else some recognition by like share, without necessarily thinking about what we're doing. I think the key point here is getting that balance between emotion and cognitive process correct, and thinking consciously about what we do. one of the things that we can do is self-awareness, which is, you know, what a lot of coaches practice: meditation, self-awareness, and then checking in and checking out. I don't think there's any magic bullet or magic wand, Deborah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, John, for being on this podcast today. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed our insights, and we'll have a listen to the next one in the series. Have a look at the Team Coaching Boutique website for more podcasts, also the TCB on our YouTube channel, and further articles on our LinkedIn page. Now, our aim is to have a positive impact in the area of team dynamics and performance. So please also follow us on Instagram.